I'm Dr. Craig Escude, the host of IDD Health Matters, a podcast where we talk about health, wellness, and health equity for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Hope you enjoy it. Hello, and welcome to this episode of IDD Health Matters. So today our guest is Eric Pines, and I'm really excited for you to learn about what he does. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Eric, talk about what you do in the field of supports and services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Thank you. So basically, I am an attorney who represents, my niche is discrimination law, disability law. In particular, happens to be I'm in the space of representing federal employees, which is about 4 million people. So it's a large group of people. But my specialty is assisting people getting reasonable accommodation in their employment, or if they're too disabled, then to assist them with getting disability. And the federal government has its own disability program called Federal Disability Retirement. Some people call it OPM disability. So I assist them with which they have to apply for Social Security disability. And then after that, they apply for federal employee disability retirement. So basically, I'm an attorney who assists disabled people with asserting their rights.
So you mentioned reasonable accommodations or getting accommodations. Can you talk more about that, what that looks like, what that means?
For sure. The best way to talk about that is to give an example. And okay. An example would be, I happen to represent a lot of veterans. So a lot of veterans I represent the VA, and civilian employees there have PTSD from their time, many times in the military. A lot of veterans obviously work for the VA. So many times they need to work from home, or they need to be put in an environment that is maybe more confined, like in their own office, because certain things will trigger their PTSD. So an example would be a VA employee who's a veteran saying, I have PTSD and I would like to work from home 4 days a week, and they will request that accommodation by using a particular form, and the law does not require them to use a form, but if they're coming to me first, I'll say use the form. Mm-hmm. However, they could just say I need accommodation, and the law, which is the Americans Disabilities Act for the federal government, it's called the Rehabilitation Act, but it's the same law. They would basically follow the reasonable accommodation process, and then the agency or the employer would turn back to them and either agree to their accommodation request, or they would say, here's an alternate, which they're allowed to do as long as that is an effective accommodation. And then if they are offered what they believe to be effective, great, they take the accommodation. If they don't think it's effective, then and they're working with me, I'll say, go to your doctor and get some backing to say that it's not effective, come back to them and say, this is not effective, and then continue what's called the interactive process. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't work. And if they are not successfully accommodated, we file a case before the EEOC, which has an federal agency that has its own administrative courts just for the federal government.
So Eric, is there any limit to the types of accommodations that someone can request, or is there really any option is available? Anything is out there?
And that's a great question. There's two ways to answer that. Number one is, first, no, there is no limit as far as creativity. A good example is I represented a client many, many years ago, and he needed a quiet office space, but he was working in an office space that was not quiet. And so, what could the government do? They're like, you're working in this environment. He didn't ask to work from home. They built him an office. So they actually built a structure because he couldn't deal with the lights flickering, because neon lights flicker, and that he had epilepsy. So the government went ahead and built him a special space inside the building that they were in, that he could close the door and have his own lighting in. So to answer your question, technically, no. Practically, there is what's called a defense for the employer, or in this case, the agency, federal agency. The defense is it poses an undue hardship, is the term, which is a term of art. And that term of art is another way of saying it either costs too much money or it is too much work for us. And then it becomes basically an assessment. A court would make the assessment of whether or not it is an undue hardship. And the last thing I'll say on that is a lot of that depends on how wealthy the employer is, how much money, how many resources they have. The federal government is great from the employee side. It's a great person to have on the other side because they're the wealthiest employer in the United States, I guess, because they can print money, right? So
right. Lots of resources.
Right. Yeah. So in general, many times, to answer your question, when the federal government, as long as it's not an undue hardship, as far as, let's say, I'll give you one last example where it would be an undue hardship potentially. Let's say I ask to work from home, but my job requires me to meet with people. So that is an undue hardship because you're not doing the essential functions of your job. Go ahead.
That's perfect, because I was going to ask you about that. Is there some sort of, I guess, requirement that you actually are able to perform the duties that are required by that job as part of this as well? And you kind of answered it. Yeah.
No, it's a great question. And it's actually twofold. Number one is you have to be qualified. Exactly your question. So the law says if you're not qualified, the law doesn't protect you, which ends up being many times very interesting because the more disabled you are, the more disabled you are, all of a sudden, boom, the law doesn't apply to you. Right. So the answer to your question is you need to be qualified, and then you have to be able to do the essential functions of your job. So.
Okay. So I bet there's been you already given us a couple of examples, but I bet there's some interesting cases that you've seen throughout the years and your work in this field, and including some successful ones. Do you have some examples that you'd like to share, or some additional examples that you can share?
Sure. I mean, many times I'm dealing with people who, well, I'll say this, lately we've been benefited by COVID-19. We're one of the few people who've been benefited. A lot of times people do need to work from home because of the difficulty in driving to work, the difficulty in the stress of getting in and out of work. I've represented represent somebody who was told he had to come to work. He was a veteran, and he is physically disabled such to the point that it actually harms his body and cause damage to his physical body for him to come to work. So the agency just, I believe, from disorganization, did not want to assist him and did not agree to his accommodation, forced him to come into the office or he would be fired. So he had to come into the office, and after a while, just by hiring me, the benefit was they realized they better take a look at it, and all of a sudden, boom, he was allowed to work at home. And so I do find that a lot of times just getting involved will actually immediately rectify the situation. Somebody will wake up and say, we better look at this and stop the bleeding. And then the question becomes, how much damages the person has, and if they still want to pursue the case. So that's one thing. Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah,
sometimes just getting in a letter from an attorney is all it takes to move the needle one way or the other, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's interesting that you brought up COVID-19 because that has done a lot, negative and positive, for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in particular. We know that people with IDD were at great risk for having bad outcomes, including increased risk of death from COVID-19. But interestingly enough, that disparity there brought to light a lot of the healthcare disparities that we know exist with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and gave us some I guess you could say just maybe some awareness in people that things need to be done a little bit differently next time, or should there be anything else similar that happens in terms of outreach for people that have health disparities, including those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So what would you say are some of the challenges that you might face, or that a person might face, when trying to get reasonable accommodations?
The main problem is working with an organization or a person on the other side who just doesn't know the law or doesn't care. Because, like I said, the law is very pro-employee. And it's interesting. It's sort of how I ended up getting into this field, because obviously as an attorney, you want to be able to help people and be successful. And, representing federal employees discrimination cases, it can be very difficult to win, let's say, a religious or racial discrimination case, because you have to have some pretty solid evidence. However, cases relating to disability accommodation, and now the law's actually changed on religious accommodation. Supreme Court case just came down, but for the first time in the past, religious accommodation case was not as strong as disability accommodation, and still is not as strong, but it's become a little stronger. Anyway, but the point I'm trying to make, as far as the law is very pro-employee, and it's one of the few areas of discrimination law that's pro-employee. So the biggest problem is when an agency or an employer just doesn't know that, they're not trained, they don't care. So at that point, then that's when you either want to study up online, figure out what your rights are and assert your rights, and be willing to go to court if you have to. And you don't always have to go to federal court, like make it all official. There's a bunch of organizations, there's a bunch of HR situations wherever you work, where you can go through a process to push the legal rights that you have. And that's what I would recommend. If you are a disabled person, if one thing that someone could take away from this podcast is you have very strong rights, and you should not be afraid to go ahead and assert them, because the law is on your side when it comes to accommodation.
That's a great point to make, and that goes along with the ADA in terms of health requirements as well too. There are requirements for clinicians' offices and hospitals that currently are not being met, that have been in the ADA for 30 years now, and they're actually strengthening some of those as well, including having accessible equipment, which is part of the original ADA, but there are still offices out there that can't weigh a person in a wheelchair, for instance, or can't, certain tests can't be performed because they don't have the necessary equipment or personnel or training to be able to do those things. So a lot of it is, I agree with you in terms from the healthcare standpoint too. A lot of it is just knowing what we are required to do as healthcare providers, and in your case as employers, to accommodate people with various types of disabilities. Yeah,
definitely.
So there's got to be some resources out there if people want to learn more about, what their rights are. Are there some that you can point us to?
Yes, for sure. For federal government, and I think this is something I shouldn't limit it to the federal government, but this is obviously the space I work in. There's a website called JAN, JAM, Job Accommodation Network. It's a federal agency, and it's a wonderful resource as far as creativity of different types of accommodations that people have used, and that if you can't think of one for yourself that might help you, you can check it out. And also there's a compilation of different regulations and rules that affect you. That's number one. Number two, I would say the EEOC. You can Google EEOC and something called basically enforcement guidelines, which talks about everything that I've talked about here, goes through all the different legal rights you have and how you assert them, what a qualified employee is, what a undue hardship is, even though that's a little bit of a gray area, but it does give you perspective. And it goes on to tell you all different types of legal rights you have, and shows examples of people who requested accommodation. Now there's my website has a lot. It's like I said, my passion. So there's a lot of blogs and resources on there where you can learn all about how you can accommodate yourself and how other people got accommodated, and gives a lot of situations kind of like we talked about today.
Well, I always like to, first of all, those are great resources. So repeat them in JAN?
JAN, Job Accommodation Network. Here,
JAN. Okay.
And then on the side here. Great.
Yeah, that'll be great. Just to make sure we can give everybody the full website, because I know people will be interested in that. And while you're doing that, we know that people with disabilities in general, including people with IDD, are underemployed, have very high unemployment rates. So we certainly, I think this information will be very valuable. So what's the website? JAN?
So it's Ask Jan, ASK Jan, JAN.org.
Great.
So, which stands for Job Accommodation Network. It's an amazing resource. Goes to employers, individuals, ADA library, COVID-19 section. publications, training. Wonderful site.
Excellent.
Friends for Life Residential Care, specializing in support for individuals with developmental disabilities, offers services like adult day support and home health care. Emphasizing empowerment and quality of life, we live by the motto, "My ability is stronger than my disability." We are currently hiring, welcoming those passionate about making a difference. Learn more and explore career opportunities at friendsforliferc.com.
I'm Dr. Craig Escude, President of Intellectability. State developmental disability agencies, managed care organizations, and providers across the United States use Intellectability's health risk screening tool, e-learn courses, and person-centered training to improve health equity for people with IDD. Visit replacingrisks.com to learn more about how you can employ these tools with people you support. So Eric, one of the things that I always do on this podcast is ask guests to tell us 3 things related to their field or their work that they would like everyone to know about, that they think can improve the world for people with disabilities and intellectual and developmental disabilities as well. So I'm going to give it to you. Tell us 3 things that you'd like everybody to know about.
Sure. Number one is something I've been hitting on the entire discussion, but I can't speak highly enough about the fact that you would think that possibly that being disabled, that the law would not necessarily protect you, but the reality is it protects you more than it protects other minorities and discrimination. The law is very pro-employee. So just to understand your rights as far as reasonable accommodation, to read up on them, to go to that site that I told you about. I myself, like I said, this is my passion. So my website, which is pinesfederal.com, pines like pine trees, federal.com, has tons and tons of resources, blogs that were through the years, I've been doing this over 20 years, go through and talk about different accommodation situations and how to assert your rights. So there's reasonable accommodation, there's pinesfederal.com. And then finally, I have a podcast myself, actually. Then I think you were on it.
I've had the pleasure of being a guest on your podcast.
And it was an absolute pleasure. We really enjoyed it and were very thoughtful. So I have a podcast myself called Disability Inclusion and Accommodation in the Workplace. That's on all the platforms, from Spotify to Apple. And I try on that podcast to basically either tell interesting stories. I try to do one of 3 things. Either tell interesting stories about people who've really accomplished a lot with their disability, and they've overcome it in many ways to use it, to leverage it as a positive. I try to do that. I try to also talk about reasonable accommodation issues. And I also try to talk about different types of accommodation, like you asked me before about creative ideas for accommodation. I'll give you an example. I had someone named Edan Mayer on for the company called Right Here, who has created a wayfinding tool on your iPhone that talks to you and tells you, instead of using Braille, that it just tells you where you are, reads menus to you and stuff like that. So I try to use, I'm kind of a tech obsessed. Yeah. So I try to bring new tech accommodation things to the world so people can learn about them, and you can find them on that podcast.
That sounds like a great resource. Would you repeat it again? Name of the podcast?
Sure. It's called Disability and Inclusion in the Workplace. And that's, like I said, on Spotify. It's on all of on Apple, all the different sources that you can reach your podcast from.
Excellent. So Eric, is there anything else you'd like to talk about in the last couple of minutes here?
No, I think that I would just say, just to recap, I think if you want to bring everything to a theme, if this podcast does one thing, it should educate people to the fact that the law is on your side, and that it's not normally on people's side. It's very hard because usually the burden of proof is on you when you're trying to bring a case for discrimination. But if you're trying to get an accommodation to allow yourself to work, the law is on your side. And I highly recommend either getting an attorney to assist you. And there are, I'm sure, I know there's a number of organizations out there for people who don't have money. If finance is an issue, that would assist you. There are people like me who do pro bono every now and then who assist you if you're situated. So if you don't have the money, I would still reach out to an attorney and see if they're willing to help you. If not, there are tons of resources to learn yourself, how to do it yourself online and to assert your rights. And the last thing I would say is many times people reach out to me and they can't afford an attorney. So I spend an hour or so on the phone with them in their review and telling them how to represent themselves and giving them the confidence that, nobody expects you, if you're representing yourself, to be an attorney. And you can get away with so much more than attorney because everyone knows and they respect the fact that we call pro se, that you're pro se. So the last thing I would say is if you feel that there's an accommodation would help you, I highly recommend go for that job, go for that situation, apply for that job, take that promotion, or if you're starting to become more disabled, and you need an accommodation, do not shy away from the legal request that you're entitled to, because the law is on your side. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eric, for enlightening us on this very important topic, and also for the great work that you do in this field.
Thank you. My pleasure. Take care.